Building a Movement to Fight Inequality. I'm Jenny Ricks. I work for ActionAid, and I've also been helping to convene the Fight Inequality Alliance, which has started among a group of organizations, and I'll speak about that in a second by way of introduction. But firstly, congratulations on making it today. You made a 9 a.m. session in a building that's very hard to find in the rain. So firstly, congratulations for being here. You've made an excellent choice. We have, no, I mean that wasn't a joke. So we have now about 2 hours for this session. And the idea of today's session is that it's quite discursive. I'll ask you to be contributing quite a lot. We'll be speaking the panelists will be speaking in English. We have one friend who will have some Spanish translation happening there, but does anyone else need translation from English to French? Or can people survive in English? Okay, great. That makes this simpler, thank you. Okay, so the idea of today's session is that we have a growing inequality crisis on our hands. The roots of it are not new to us, but it is growing more powerful in its current forms. And so today is about exploring two things. The session is in two parts. One is looking at the different causes and perspectives of rising inequalities. So we'll hear some contributions from our panelists about what's happening, why the big increase in concentration in power and wealth is happening, and take some perspectives from the floor about why so many different parts of civil society see this as an increasing threat and something that we have to step up the fight back on. And then in the second part, we will look more towards solutions and strategies. So listening to stories from people where they are already organizing, already fighting back, and what can we learn from those struggles? And then think about how we build those struggles more globally, more towards the national and the global level, and think about how we build a larger movement. So before I'll introduce our panelists in a second. We have a really brilliant panel. But by way of a little bit of introduction, a group of organizations from across different sectors. So you'll have maybe seen on the flyer, the inequality has become an increasing concern for many different organizations. So ActionAid, my own organization, the development NGO, Oxfam, the International Trade Union Confederation, Amnesty, Civicus, Greenpeace, Femnet, ACT Alliance, Focus on the Global South, Asia Pacific Movement on Debt and Development, a whole range of groups have already been fighting inequalities in many ways for a long time. But the extent to which power and wealth has become concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer elites has become a more pressing problem. It's been well documented over recent years. Everybody agrees that rising inequalities is a huge threat to all the struggles we're engaged in for a fairer and more just world and a more sustainable world. But I think all of these organizations and many more decided that more concerted action needed to be taken. We needed to try and challenge power on a deeper level than perhaps we had been doing before, and look at how to unite across these different struggles. Welcome, Liddy. This is Liddy Nakpil, one of our panelists. So we need to get you a chair, Liddy.
Here, this one there.
Looking at ways that we could help to deepen the struggle and the pushback against inequalities. So both what we could do at an international level in helping challenge the narrative around inequalities and how the solutions to inequalities are defined, and make sure that in tackling the problem, it's not just incremental business as usual, but that we really get systemic transformation. And also really looking at how we could support movements growing in different countries around the world, as that is where a lot of the concrete struggles and campaigning will be taking place. So we've begun that conversation and begun that thinking, and this session is an opportunity both to explore some of those different perspectives about why groups want to convene around this agenda, and then look together at some solutions coming from the ground in different countries and how that might be amplified nationally and internationally. So I will introduce our panel and then kick off with our first speaker. We have you may have seen on the flyer, we do not have Jay Naidu with us today. He's unfortunately still in South Africa. Not a visa issue, I hasten to add, but he's unfortunately not here. But it does mean that I have the honor, probably for the first time, of chairing an all-female panel. Which I'm extremely happy about, I have to say. It's not something that I planned, but I'm extremely happy about it. And particularly, I think, on issues that include economics, intersectional with all the other issues, but we often find that all male panels creep in. As soon as we start to talk about the economy, the number of men on the panel does often start to creep up. So I'm extremely happy that we have an all-female panel today. Our first speaker will be Shamali Guttal, who's the Exec Director of Focus on the Global South, which is a Pan-Asian activist think tank and research outfit. We'll then hear from Lena Holguin and Jenny Glasgow from Oxfam, Quebec, who've been doing some brilliant research on youth and inequality, so have some of that youth perspective to share with us today on International Youth Day. So good timing for that. We also have Mojdeh Cox from the Canadian Labour Congress. She's the regional representative in Ontario. We have Liddy Nakpil from Asia Pacific Movement for Debt and Development. And we also have Joki Jehu from Daughters of Mumbi Global Resource Centre in Kenya. So a really brilliant, diverse panel who have a huge amount of knowledge, skills and experience to share with us to help stimulate the discussion with the rest of the group. So that's it for the introductions. We will have our first three interventions from the panel, and then open it up for discussion on other perspectives on the inequality crisis as our first lot, and then come back to the panel for more two more inputs, and then open it out for discussion again. So firstly, Shamali, over to you. Okay. There is a mic there if you want it.
People can hear me all right with this? Do I need this?
Can people hear?
For the recording.
Yeah. Oh, you need for the recording. So,
there we go.
Okay. So you all can hear me, right?
Yes.
All right, good. So I'll just start off. Good. So I won't go into statistics and information about inequality because as Jenny said, it's widely accepted that inequality is one of the most enduring and entrenched problems and challenges that the world is facing. And there are tons of reports over the last decade. In fact, banks, the Credit Suisse, it's not just activists like us, social justice activists, but the mainstream financial establishment is producing statistics after statistics showing the depth and the extent of inequality for different reasons, albeit from us. But the information is there, right? So a few words about how we see inequality before I share with you some analysis on what I think are the structural causes. One is I don't think inequality is not a surface phenomenon. It's not something that can be rectified by diverting cash here or there, but it's a very deep structural defect. It diminishes individual and collective potential for many, and it shapes power relations, both within and across societies and across nations, And that's why I think it's very important to look at the issues of inequality globally, but also what are the ramifications of that nationally and locally when we look at the historical causes. Because it feeds on itself. That's the entrenchment aspect of it. So that's one point I'd like to make. Another one is that it creates differentiating factors across and within countries, both north and south. And I'll go to that when we get into the reasons. Wealth is not an equalizer. And without just redistributive measures, the creation of wealth will always create poverty. And one of the big problems that we've had with the whole development model and this whole poverty reduction model is that there's never been a check on wealth creation, a particular type of wealth creation. And that's led us into a sort of a downward spiral in terms of inequality of opportunity, assets, and so on. And in Asia, I think for sure, and definitely it seems globally as well, we're witnessing a net transfer of wealth, public access and control over natural resources to already wealthy elites, to upper classes and private corporations. And this is happening through a variety of illegal mechanisms and illegal practices. So there is redistribution, but not in the direction that it should happen. It's going the other way. It's perverse. And this is where a certain type of, this redistribution from the working classes, from rural communities, from middle classes, from the poor, from women, from young people, from future generations, to an opportunistic and already elite class, or already those who already have opportunities. This kind of transfer is a formation of wealth. Is a process of creating wealth, which is a very, very dangerous process because there is no justice redistribution there. So there are many dimensions and levels of inequality. There's of course the economic there's the economic side of it, there's the money side of it, there's the asset side of it. But then there's also inequalities, by class, by race, by gender, inequalities by power, wealth, opportunity, consumption. There are lots of, shaping characteristics that not exactly determine, but that certainly influence our position in the inequality chains. No, there's gender identity, there's political voice and agency, cultural identity, sexual identity, religion. In many, many countries in Asia, those of certain religions are systematically not allowed access to certain services and political, and political voice. I mean, in a Buddhist country like Burma, the Rohingya are being singled out by Buddhist monks. This is the great faith of compassion, and they become stateless people, and the violence perpetrated against them is terrible. In Thailand, the Southerners, who are mostly Malay Muslims, are again targeted. And I think we can give you many examples about this type of thing later. Inequality also has to do with dignity, food, access to justice, participation in governance, political voice. So, there are many dimensions of inequality. And I think the most obvious one, yes, is the economic one. And often that is, because that's the most visible one. But the economic financial assets or part of inequality is drawn from and also shapes the other political and social and cultural dimensions of inequality. So it's a very complex. It's a complex problem, and I'm not saying this because I'm saying that we don't have a solution. We do have maybe multiple solutions, but it's not quite as simple as just increasing incomes. There are a number of other structures that need to be addressed. There are a number of ideologies that need to be addressed. I won't even touch on patriarchy yet because I'm hoping that Yogi will touch on that. And one of the things that we're seeing is that diverse forms of wealth, for example, land, knowledge, people's capacities, people's coping mechanisms, these diverse forms, these are all forms of wealth because these are things that help us to build and sustain and nurture communities and societies. These are being captured and expressed in terms of monetary wealth. And the interesting thing about monetary wealth is it's tradable. So monetary wealth is a lot more easily tradable than, say, land. But if you take 1,000 hectares of land and put a land title on it, that land title is tradable. You can't physically pick up that land and trade it, but you can trade the land title. You know, the Asian Development Bank in our region is promoting water trading rights. You can't take a river and trade it, but if you parcel out sections of water bodies and water sources, communities can trade those. You know, and this is, believe it or not, being actually promoted as a form of reducing inequality. But we'll get to that point later. So I have 5 more minutes or
yes,
less? Fine. Or whatever. Tell me when I'm going over the top. Okay. Sorry. I tend to get carried away sometimes. Okay. So let's look at causes. I think we have historical causes and we have contemporary causes, ongoing causes, etc. I think I would look at causes from the point of the creation and the entrenchment of inequality. You know? So we have historical causes at both individual and collective levels. So there's, in my country, India, there's caste, you know? There's race, there's different cultural communities, there's occupational segregation, there's religion. In many other countries, you don't have caste, but you still have race, ethnicity. Of course, class is everywhere. Historically, we've had colonialism, which has been one of the biggest, most significant factors that laid a foundation for inequality, from for draining the wealth of the colonies, to the mothership, wherever the mothership was, right? And so what we've seen is that inequality has been created and entrenched through a process of accumulation and capture. So wealth of a certain kind or a certain group is captured, kept by the capturer, if that's the word, by the grabber. And then that allows them to accumulate more, because when you have some, you have the advantage, you can create the structural conditions to acquire more. But of course, the other awkward side of it is that it's never enough. Once you start accumulating, you will need to keep accumulating, and this is where the processes of capitalism come in, which is, once you start accumulating wealth, once accumulation of wealth takes a certain form, the next step is more accumulation, more accumulation. And when there is no more wealth of a certain type to be captured, wealth will be created to be captured. So, for example, if we look at the green economy, which was presented by the United Nations Environment Programme in the last Rio Summit, it was unveiled rather, right? The green economy basically takes nature, the last frontier of life, really, or the first frontier and the last frontier for capture, and converts wealth that can be accumulated. So biodiversity is wealth, it's natural wealth. But if you put that into the market, it's something that creates a tradable, accumulatable wealth, which is very different from the accumulated knowledge and actual wealth of biodiversity. And I'm very happy to share this platform with Liddy, because Liddy's been working on climate change for so long. Because this is the issue of resilience, the issue of coping. This is wealth. This is the knowledge of our communities across the world, not just in the South, in the North, in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, all over the world. Local communities have they have knowledge and forms of resilience and seeds and so on. That's their wealth. Now, when you alienate that wealth, and by making it a tradable, which is what's happening with the green economy, that's an expropriation. That's a transfer of wealth by capturing it, converting it into a sort of something that you can put onto a market, something that you can trade, which is. So I'm sorry, if we want, I will get trapped in this one. So so I would say accumulation and capture. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with David Harvey. He talks about accumulation through dispossession. And this is a very, very important aspect of the entrenchment of inequality today, is accumulation through dispossession and capture through dispossession. Contemporary causes, if we start looking at what's been happening in the last, say, 10 years or 20 years, I think the main cause is theft. There's no nicer way of putting it. it's through a variety of legal and non-legal means. So we know in the 70s and 80s, we had the debt crisis, which Njoki and Lady both know about very well. They were leading the fight against the debt crisis of the South. There were then the structural adjustment programs promoted by the international financial institutions. Our economies of the South were completely reoriented from addressing long-standing challenges, national domestic challenges, to feed the debtors and to feed wealthy economies who were all the former colonists, right? So this is the neocolonialism started off, was sort of put in gear through that. There was a complete exploitation and expropriation of natural wealth, which trapped a lot of countries into becoming, into that was the only form of revenue generation, was selling the very basis of life. If you sell the very basis of life, what do you have to live with later? Because it will go, it will deplete at some time, no? And there was a rollback of all social protection, public services, and public interest systems. So in our countries where there should have been redistribution for the poor, there should have been redistribution in public policy to address inequality, there wasn't, because those systems were dismantled in order to meet debt target, to economic growth, etc., etc. Then we had the trade and investment liberalization and privatization. Almost everything was privatized. Healthcare was privatized, education was privatized, water was privatized, security is privatized, social security is privatized, So again, this is related to rolling back, national systems for redistribution and protecting the public interest. And this is very, very important because the public interest and the state's role in maintaining and protecting the public interest is very important to create equality of opportunity and equality of outcomes. Because you can't have equality of opportunity and outcomes when there are no structures for it. So, in response to land redistribution, agrarian reform, which was a rallying cry of many countries during the liberation struggles, the World Bank had a very good response to it, good from their point of view. They brought in market-assisted land reform. One of the most insidious forms of governing land is market-assisted land reform. And the idea was that you create banks, a willing buyer, willing seller. So poor people have to take loans from a fund created by the World Bank and the government to pay rich landowners who have sat on thousands of hectares of land for generations. This is land that they stole. And they're getting more money to keep sitting on it. And this is in order to, and the whole logic of this was in order to make sure that redistribution is just, and to create an even level playing field for international national actors and so on. So there are lots and lots of examples like this. I won't go into the details of that. Then there was, of course, trade and investment liberalization with the World Trade Organization in 1995, sort of launched it. But then after the World Trade Organization's wheels got stuck in the mud, that wasn't the end of trade liberalization. Then we had different types of free trade agreements. We have plurilateral trade agreements. We have bilateral investment agreements. We have what are called new generation trade and investment agreements, like the RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in ASEAN and China. You all heard about the TTIP and the TPP. These are very famous, but the EU-ASEAN work investment agreement. There's the India-EU agreement. All of these have in them special procedures by which corporations, particularly foreign corporations, can have access to wealth, assets, land, water, and other privileges in host countries. And they're completely above the law. They can sue the state through investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. So, if Viola has a water contract and the water provision is not up to speed, it's not up to standard, if the water quality is bad, if it's overpriced, and if the government cancels the contract, Viola can sue the Indian government or Cambodia or Thailand or wherever it's having its contract. And the case goes to the the tribunal of the World Bank, which is the International Council for Settlement of Industrial Disputes. So it's not even that we're not even talking about governance or arbitration in the International Court of Justice or The Hague or something like that. We're talking about these private tribunals that are set up by the very institutions that have pushed for an economic model that has entrenched inequality and has actually made no progressive moves to challenge inequality. Now, I think one of the things in the last 20 years with economic growth is that economic growth has completely now, it dominates concepts of well-being. And perhaps a big imperative for this was the collapse of the Soviet bloc and this whole end of history narrative that was happening in the 90s. Because not that socialism wasn't accumulating capital, not that socialism or communism was not destroying nature, but at least there was some kind of a counterforce to capitalism. And I think from the 90s onwards, when we see the expansion of an advance of capitalism, it's taken on a particularly virulent form. And very important in this is financial globalization and financialization. Because our lives are financialized in a way that we don't even know. And financialization takes a lot of forms, and it has a very deep and very important relationship to creating inequality. So, for example, a lot of land in Asia, a lot of the investors in different types of land, they look to be agricultural companies. They're actually financial corporations. A lot of financial, corporations like banks, insurance companies, hedge funds are investing in land. I saw a PowerPoint presentation, but I wasn't allowed to steal it off my friend's computer, from I think it was Merrill Lynch, the meeting of financial investors. The whole presentation was on water as a new assets class. It was really scary. It was really, really scary because they went into this whole thing of the deprivation and the importance of water and life. And then it says how this is an opportunity. So you create a whole assets class for water. So, I mean, and this is, this was very visible, in the sense it's not like this was a spy versus spy. This was at a big auditorium. It was at a big convention on financial investors, etc. Okay, I should stop soon. So what I'd like to say, I guess, is that financial markets and financialization have linked countries and people in far deeper ways than the globalization of production. Because even if our countries don't have are no longer in those globalized value chains, they're still financialized. So in 1997, when the Asian financial crisis hit, and there was all this criticism about why did Thailand bail out the private sector, it had actually no choice. It shouldn't have. But it had no choice because the financial sector had control over all the production. And the millions of jobs that would have gone, and etc., scared the government so much. But this is another controversial issue that we can discuss later. And then there are new sources of capital coming and going, spreading around the world. And we see that with crisis after crisis, people think, okay, this must be the end of capitalism, but no, it keeps reinventing itself. And we just have to look at the climate change, climate crisis and see how cynical global capitalism and finance capital has become, and how the wealth entrenchers, how cynical they've become. And I think before I close, I would just like to say that I make a pitch for people to really look at the entire issue of land, water, territory, and nature. Because investments based on land, water, nature, territory are actually resulting in dispossession and environmental destruction on a scale that we haven't seen. In the last 10, 15 years, we've seen this. I mean, this is a different scale, the escalation of this kind of dispossession. And I think these are purposive acts at consolidating and concentrating wealth, resources and power in the hands of a very elite minority. And it may not, because again, these are the final forms of wealth left in a planet that's going through planet collapse. Because Mother Nature will always win over us. It's human beings don't seem to see the limits, right? And grabbing whatever they can. Development is a huge culprit, but we can talk about that later, because development increasingly is only about economic growth. And public interest today is expressed in market terms, in the language of markets. So what is good for a corporation is good for the public. That's how it's being expressed. So development is a very serious issue and is an inequality creator. And I can give you several examples of development in Asia which have created inequality, have led to evictions, dispossession, environmental contamination, and so on. So another big challenge with inequality that's come through development and investment is escalating violence, wars, and escalating wars and violence and criminalization. And we have a publication about that over there. And finally, I'd just like to say, I think we need to look for what I call Rosa Parks moments, and perhaps we can talk about that in the strategies. Thank you for listening, and I'm sorry to be so long.
Thank you, Sharmali. That was an incredibly rich oversight of all the different dimensions of the structural causes of inequality. I think it's really important that we have that full picture of the issue, and I think the recent wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people is the entry point into that wider discussion. So it's important for us to stand all the roots, and an excellent historical look through some of the different manifestations of how this crisis has played out in many ways over the last 40 plus years. So yeah, excellent introduction. Thank you very much. So let's move on now to Lina and Jenny, who are going to focus in more on the youth question. So this is our only PowerPoint. So we're gonna dim the lights slightly. They will go back up again afterwards.
So thank you very much for being here today and for inviting us, Jenny, to this panel today. So again, my name is Lina Holguin, and I'm the Policy Director in Oxfam, Quebec. And I had the privilege to write a paper on youth and inequality, time to support youth as agents of their own future, together with Jenny. And Jenny is a PhD student here in McGill in the anthropology department, and we've been working on this paper for several months now, so we're very happy to be launching it today. You can bring copies of the paper, but you can find it in oxfam.org. It's in the front page. Maybe if you want to say something more about you.
Sure, just briefly I could say I'm a PhD student in anthropology here, but the reason I got linked up with Oxfam is my research is also based in Kenya, but really looking at youth livelihoods in a couple of different rural areas in the south, and looking at how young people are creatively both building adequate livelihoods for themselves, but also acting to address inequality in their communities.
You're also a very young woman.
Yes, I'm also, as a young woman, very concerned with inequality, and so we'll give some examples of movements also in the global north. This isn't an issue, all youth should be concerned about inequality.
So I think that, I think that the previous presentation is a great introduction to what we're going to present now, because it gave us the history. And now I think that what we want to do is look at the future. And the future, as a mother of a 15-year-old and an 8-year-old, looks quite green with what we just heard. but also with the whole issue of climate change. And even though it looks grim, young of today are very aware of this. They are also doing amazing things to be active, and in the presentation we will be talking about that. We also want to mention briefly that Oxfam organized in the past 2 days a youth summit. We had youth from around 30 countries from almost all the regions in the world, and they were here discussing about youth and inequality. We heard fantastic stories from them on what they are doing, and we also heard on what they want us, the adults, the governments, to do. They were working in a manifesto on youth and inequality. That manifesto is going to be, I believe, presented tomorrow. So that manifesto, what Jenny and I could say, what the stories that we heard, the demands we heard, I think that confirm what we are putting in this paper, and the stories we heard reaffirming what in the daily, everyday life of youth they are facing and living with this huge inequality crisis we're having. So to go now the presentation, we will talk first about briefly about the context and youth population, and I will explain why Oxfam decided to prioritize youth and inequality. Jenny will talk a bit about the problem more directly, how inequality is impacting youth. Then we will give some examples of some initiatives being taken by the different actors, including youth, and we'll finalize with some recommendations. So today we have the biggest youth population in the world. In 2014, the United Nations Population Fund said we had 1.8 billion youth between the ages of 10 and 24. And then, but also, the definition of youth, who are youth, it is not a common definition around the world. It depends very much on issues of social and cultural construction. In Oxfam, if you want to say Oxfam, when we refer to youth, we're referring to those of the age between 15 and 24, and that's the same definition that the UN is giving. So now in this map, what you can see is that the youth are mainly concentrated in developing countries. Sub-Saharan Africa, you have 70% of the population under 30. And in most of the world poorest country, the majority of youth are unemployed and are living in poverty. But we believe that with the right engagement and policy, this countries could benefit hugely from a demographic dividend. So as Jenny is going to explain, inequality is affecting hugely youth. But before that, I need to explain why Oxfam is focusing on this. So we have been working historically with youth in Oxfam, and in many countries. We have some colleagues here that will talk about the 4-year program that we have on My Rights, My Voice. And in our strategic plan, we clearly focus on youth as active citizens. And then we have the inequality campaign we launched in 2014, and we identified youth as a population that is affected by inequalities, but also as a group that can contribute hugely to the fight against extreme inequality. So maybe you can start now talking about it.
Great. So thanks so much. The first presentation gave a really excellent overview of the problem of inequality. I won't repeat too much. I'll try not to. But of course, the first point to make is just to add on to the excellent point about the multidimensional aspects of inequality, to point out that youth, again, is not a homogeneous group, and some youth are going to suffer from multiple inequalities. Just being a young person to begin with you're already suffering inequality in terms of access to employment, for example, in relation to older people. But then within and between young people, of course, you have massive inequalities between young people living in rural areas versus urban areas, between men and women, young people of different religions or ethnic groups, and all of the other examples that were given. So Oxfam, just to say briefly, also agrees in the big report that we put out in 2015 on inequality that the two driving causes of inequality are, first of all, market fundamentalism, which is some of those examples that were given around huge privatization, kind of out of control power with financial institutions, and also political capture by elite. So this huge problem whereby politicians are not accountable to the more vulnerable parts of society or the masses. They are motivated by the needs of an elite. So we'll talk here very quickly about three types of inequality that affect youth specifically. I'll be quite brief. Of course, we recognize the divisions between economic and, say, political inequality are a bit artificial, and they all reinforce and kind of overlap on each other. It's not a clear distinction. But economic inequality specifically impacts youth, first of all, because it limits social mobility. This is fairly obvious, but in countries with high economic inequality, if you are born into a poor household, it is much, much more difficult as a young person to gain wealth or join the middle class. Access to basic services such as healthcare and education is a huge problem, and that impacts youth specifically, whether through privatization or simply a lack of motivation by the government or lack of ability to provide enough quality public healthcare and education. Young people, many young people around the world suffer without access to basic services. And then youth, of course, when we have recessions caused often by irresponsible financial practices, young people suffer disproportionately. So there was a 2015 study by the ILO showing that in times of economic recession, young people are often the first group to lose jobs. And then even after a recession has passed, young people will take longer to recover their jobs. So I won't go into the details of all of these. Of course, we have young people often are being manipulated or are more likely to get involved in violent or extremist groups in unequal societies. So the other forms we looked at, political inequality, a big point of this paper is that young people lack means of communication with policymakers. And of course, climate change is one of the main forms of inequality affecting young people. We have the example of the Marshall Islands, for example, where even if we limit climate change to 2 degrees Celsius, that entire country is likely to disappear. And so there's been some pretty amazing activism by youth from the Marshall Islands pointing out the urgency of their situation. It's not just about damaging livelihoods in the future, it's really jeopardizing young futures altogether. So now we'll talk very briefly about some initiatives that are in place to address these problems, but I know we only have a few minutes left, so we'll go quickly.
Okay. So 2013, 2014, there was a 50% increase of the number of countries with national youth policies. And that is demonstrating sort of the interest, the growing interest from governments to respond to youth needs. Right now, we have 131 countries with national youth policies. Those that are in red in this map, including Canada, do not have a national youth policy for the moment. We also see a growing interest for multilateral and regional organizations to implementing programs addressed to youth, which are mainly focused on employment, entrepreneurship, and education. In the paper, we have several examples, one included from the World Bank and others. We also see that from the civil society organizations, there is also an interest, a growing interest to be looking at the issue of political participation and leadership, and we believe these are the kind of initiatives that should be scaled up. And regarding these huge programs on employment, education, and those initiatives is important, is needed, but our call is that we need to move beyond. And there needs to be a huge priority on social political participation of youth, tackle the issue of gender equality, but most importantly is the issue of norms and behaviors. Because there are programs, for instance, that are addressed to create employment for young women, but if in that community still the norm is that young women need to stay at home and take care of the kids and clean the house and wash the dishes, and then that program is for certainly going to fail. So I think that the issue of norms, behaviors, and attitudes is very central when we're talking about tackling inequality. Then there is also in the last 5 years an explosion of summits and meetings of trying to put together in the same room youth and leaders. And the question we're asking is, who is really represented there? Are we still continuing with the political capture in this arena in terms of the representation of the youth that are taking message there? And I mean, I can give you an example of a couple of summits where I participated, where I observed some of these. And then there is also this effort, and the UN did a huge one in consulting via using digital platforms. And it's, I think it's really important, and those initiatives are great and are working because yes, are reaching a larger number of youth, but we also need to remember there are still many youth that don't have any access to internet still. Finally, I mean, we did in the paper sort of this table listing sort of the different frameworks that have been taking place since '95 with the different sort of global policies on youth. And we have the latest one, what is the Sustainable Development Goals. And so what I will end in this section saying is we have the commitment from governments on the Sustainable Development Goals, we have climate change, and I think that is crucial then that we see that this is the implication of youth there is crucial, but also that we need all and youth to ensure that these promises are delivered.
So one of the major goals of the paper was to shine a spotlight on some of the incredible movements and actions being led by youth around the world fighting against inequality. I won't get into them here, but point out that this is not an issue of youth in one part of the world. So I think the recent massive young support for Bernie Sanders in the United States, for example, is a good way of showing that youth in North America are equally concerned with inequality. We need governments to understand and reach out a little bit more to understand what youth in their particular jurisdictions are already doing to solve the problems they face. Young people are not idly sitting around. They are working very hard to solve their own problems. So one example that's very much related to inequality was the Chilean student protests around education. I'm sure we've all seen that in the news. They were successful just this year in having the president announce free university for a limited number of students. In West Africa, there have been a number of very successful youth movements around democratic participation and corruption that we can talk more about. And so we'll just close by touching on what needs to happen next.
So yes, we have several recommendations addressed in the paper for governments, government, civil society, and the private sector. And I think that I will let you, I hope that you will all go and look at those recommendations specifically. I would like to mention three important ones, and one that I take at heart as a mom, as a mother, and is that we need to become truly allies and partners of youth. And we need to stop alienating youth from decisions starting at home and in our community, and take them seriously. And the second one is that It is crucial that we understand and acknowledge that youth are living multiple inequalities and some group of youth are living multiple discriminations. I think that we need to stop. So thank you very much. And anyway, we can discuss further in the discussion.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lena and Jenny. Can we have the lights back up? Brilliant. So panel can return to the front. So we're going to carry straight on for the final input of this round before we open up for some discussion or some more additions to the different perspectives on inequality. So we're starting to build a really rich picture there with some more depth on the youth element, both in terms of how youth are affected and are also a key force for creating change on inequalities. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Mojdeh Cox from Canadian Labour Congress.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the order of where my presentation is live, because the framework has been laid quite well by the presentations before me. My panel contribution I'd like to dub as being called Beyond Equality, Unions and the Fight for Equity for All. So now you wouldn't naturally expect to have a trade unionist in the front of the room without in some way disrupting the status quo. So in true spirit of trade unionism, I want to ask you to challenge yourself by reframing justice and fairness and shift from thinking about equality to thinking about equity. Now, first, it's important to understand the difference between equality and equity. Now, very simply, equality is an expression of the fact that two or more quantities are equal or the same in distribution. Sounds fair enough. Now, equity is the quality of being fair and impartial. So equality is in essence rooted in quantity, and equity stems from quality. In addition to my work with the Canadian Labour Congress, I'm a community educator in anti-racism and anti-oppression. And so in the community, one way I sort of apply this is by giving an audience similar to yourself an 8.5 by 11 piece of scrap paper, ask you to crumple it up, and from wherever you're positioned, you aim at a trash bin in the center of the room. So that's an equal distribution of an asset, and you all get a fair shot because the bin isn't moving around. It's simply put. Some people are usually without any bribery or incentive, really keen on going for the challenge. Others, based on their position in the room, generally forfeit and think they don't really have a clear chance. In the end, though, overall, it is agreed that it isn't enough just to give everyone the same quantity of anything and expect that their quality of life is improved in the same way. And this has been reiterated by our Oxfam comrades at the panel who talked about how youth are impacted differently, and that goes for all populations. The last things I would say about equality, that I would say about the difference between equality and equity, is that equality intentionally or unintentionally removes the social and political factors out of the equation and boils it down to mathematics. Equity considers historical context that was provided here, institutional barriers in the human experience, and allows room for accountability of people and institutional bodies to unlearn their personal biases. So all of these events, from the land appropriation and theft to structural adjustment policies to the plight of the youth today, aren't just phenomena that are forced in some sort of mystical way. People are behind these movements and actions and world milestones. Most importantly, equity makes room for an intersectional analysis of human experiences and considers multiple layers of identities and factors as it relates to individuals' chance for justice and fairness. Equity gets to the root cause of inequality and systems of oppression. So the labor movement is moving closer and closer to changing how we frame fairness by striving for more equity. Now, activists in the labor movement are challenging the growing inequities in our communities from various angles. And as I am Canadian, I will provide, and representing a Canadian labor body, I will provide examples in a local context. But I am certain that there will be some parallels in the experiences of people in this room in your respective countries of origin. So just to look at a little bit of a snapshot into Canada, in a paper called The Shameful Neglect, Indigenous Child Poverty in Canada, released by the Center, or rather the CCPA, Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, in May 2016, 3 tiers of poverty were highlighted in this paper, based on color, immigration, indigeneity, and this report illustrates an unquestionable inequity of First Nations children as they live, 51% live in poverty here in Canada of the total Indigenous child population. So through the understanding of this long-standing truth, the Canadian Labour Congress has stood behind Indigenous communities and their plight for an inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The Canadian Labour Congress acknowledges that the gross legacy of colonialism, land appropriation, and residential schools, Indigenous communities really face unique challenges stemming from generations of trauma. Overall, Canada's child poverty stats hover over the OECD average over about 3 to 4% over that average. Child poverty is a great measure of how we're doing as a nation. And after all, it isn't children who contribute to their own poverty. It is their parents and caregivers in their communities who, in various degrees, are facing extreme barriers navigating through systems. And those systems, through varying degrees, are either working in their advantage or disadvantage. The Canadian Labour Congress advocates for a universal childcare plan for all because we recognize that adequate, affordable, and accessible childcare means parents and caregivers have fewer limitations in obtaining and maintaining work that is sustainable and could support their livelihood. We also know that a safe and nurturing environment for children in their formative years, ages birth to 5 years, greatly influences their life experience and their quality of life going forward. This initiative was at its peak with the Canadian Labour Congress and our community partners during the 2015 federal elections. Working with our affiliates, advocacy groups, and community-based coalition, Labour has taken on this plight, and we're not stopping. There's been some recent changes to child benefits in the country, but we're not stopping there. This is just one response to the challenge of child poverty. We can also look at Canada's labour market for insight on why the gap between the rich and the poor is widening. And in the midst of, precarious employment is a major issue today. It is said to be the new norm in the Canadian labour market. So the current Canadian labour market is saturated by part-time, low-wage, unstable, and work that is not unionized. It lacks benefits and retirement security, not to mention even adequate pay to begin with. Some even facing severe challenges as wage theft. In March 2015, the Canadian Labour Congress released a statement on the need for the $15 in fairness across Canada. Now, I see some sort of eyes widening, so I do think that there's some recognition of what the 15 in fairness is. This campaign has been an ongoing campaign pushing for a $15 minimum wage across the country, as well as more protections for vulnerable workers. So in 2015, there were over 1,200,000 workers earning the primary minimum wage or less. And now minimum wage is mandated provincially, so across Canada there is a sliding scale of what minimum wage looks like, but we're looking at over 1 million workers making that or less, and that's the piece that we need to hone in on. Beyond the statement that we've released around, the need for 15 and fairness, the Labour and community has joined forces in Ontario, just a hop and a skip away, around the movement for the Changing Workplaces Review. And what this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to review labor laws, basic labor laws, and basic employment standards and policy at a provincial level. We are at so this is our response to precarity being saturated in our labor market. In the meantime, as we sort of pick up our game, so to speak, on more creatively organizing. Now, we're at a pivotal time in this campaign. The Ontario Federation of Labour, the Canadian Labour Congress, our affiliates and partners are relentlessly pushing forward for the province to make Ontario fair, to make it fair in Ontario and give workers the protection they deserve. Powerful initiatives led by our Labour was to lobby and advocate for retirement security for all by expanding the Canadian pension plan and ensuring that Canadian old age security is also aligned. This is all going to make sense as to when I really sort of connect the dots between all of these initiatives that we've taken on, some quite successfully so far. Labour has successfully reversed the Harperite decision. So we're just coming out of a very dysfunctional era in our country, and that is the most diplomatic way I can possibly say it. And it's only because this is permanently on YouTube. Catch me candidly later. Now, the decision to increase the eligibility age for old age security from 65 to 67 rather, offsetting it by 2 years to when generally individuals in Canada choose to retire at 65. We've successfully been able to reverse that now that Harper is off doing his thing. And now we've aligned it back with the CPP. Now, just in June, the Canadian Labour Congress and our affiliates, did some quasi-celebration. And I say quasi because we haven't seen this implemented yet. During the first plan expansion for the Canadian pension plan. So this is the first expansion in 50 years. This is a big deal. This is a universal pension plan aimed at income security for the most vulnerable seniors in our country. And for the first time in 50 years, we are looking at making a modest increase. This is just one step closer to closing that gap amongst seniors. Beyond advocating for policy changes, Canadian Labour Congress has supported grassroots movements demanding for their lives to be valued. So the lives of whomever these movements are representing. And one example is the Black Lives Matters movement. Now, this movement spiraled out of generations and generations of devastation and destruction, of exploitation and oppression. One hashtag changed everything and challenged our notion of fairness by asking us to sort of check our privilege or lack of privilege, when we say, or when it's said, that all lives matter. So because that is the truth, most of us in this room would like to at least outwardly admit that we believe all lives matter. But Black Lives Matter challenges us to think, why for so many generations have Black lives not mattered? equally. So after the recent police killing of Abdi Rahman Abdi in Ottawa, a 37-year-old Somali man without any previous criminal record, he was beaten to death by Ottawa police just weeks ago. The Canadian Labour Congress called on Canadian mayors across the country to address the use of lethal force by police and address systemic racism in policing. We organize where organized labor has the potential to address inequity on a deeper level is addressing issues at their root cause, namely systemic oppression and actions and policies which uphold privilege and systems of advantage for some. So what I have highlighted for you are initiatives that not only benefit workers and organized workers rather in unions. What I have highlighted for you is the role of labor and what we do in our community, in our society, as we play the role of agents for change, agents for fairness and justice. And so sometimes we have to convince ourselves why these are labor issues. And that's okay. That's a part of growth. That's what happens in movements. Sometimes we question things and sometimes we have answers and other times we don't. But every human is a potential worker, a current worker, or a former worker. So at every stage in life, dignity and fairness are rights. And this is why all of the above initiatives are worker issues, despite them not necessarily impacting workers in the workplace, particularly. So Canadian Labour has been the agent for change and will continue to be. Now, I will close by a quote, and as cheesy as it might be, I want to say that, sometimes we need inspiration in some way that is tangible in our minds, and we can sort of keep it in hindsight when we're working this sort of thankless fight for equity and justice. Nelson Mandela had said that as long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persists in our world, none of us can truly rest. And I will let you know that Canadian Labour will not rest, as our roots stem from a radical fight for justice for the most vulnerable people. That is our mission, that is our mandate, our collective interest has an opportunity to influence the life of every person in this country and beyond. Now, we have a variety of challenges. We have the potential to address root causes. We're continuing to work on naming issues. So very recently, we have boldly made statements around racism, systemic racism, privilege. We teach our members upon entry into the union movement on what that means and where they fall in the spectrum of privilege. We need to work on helping even our members in our community to unpack the emotions that comes with unearned privilege and perhaps the emotions of anger and resentment that may come from our lack of privilege. But the struggle continues. So I will close there. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Majda. That was another excellent contribution to fleshing out why the labour movement is such a shared struggle with other parts of civil society, and a great challenge to us to think more in terms of equity. We use the word inequality. I think it's become the way of describing the phenomenon that we're talking about. But when we examine its roots and the picture we've all been building here, I think the vision of equity that you were describing is certainly where everyone's coming from. So it's a good challenge to think of the terminology that we're using. So just so everyone in the audience, I'm sure there's other perspectives here. Before we move on to the solutions and strategies part about how we learn from and scale up our struggles against inequality, I wanted to open up for a couple of contributions if others are here from the environmental movement, the human rights movement, just to hear a few more perspectives maybe about why people see this as such a common shared challenge that we need to collaborate on. If there's any other contributions that people wanted to make. And this isn't your only chance to contribute, by the way. We'll have more time for shared experiences and stories in the second part too. But if anyone had, we have one there, and any others? Okay, yeah. Do you want to come down and use the mic?
So, good morning, everyone. My name is Hiba Antoun, and I am a youth, and I come from Lebanon. And I'm quite interested in the youth inequalities and the inequalities that we are facing as youth coming from different parts of the world. Because inequality, it doesn't tackle only one geographic region, common in the whole world, and each and every one of us is suffering from it in a way or another. I come from Lebanon, which is a region in the Middle East. And I know you've probably heard a bit about the Middle East, but we do have several inequalities that we are suffering from. So the MENA region in general and Lebanon, I'm gonna talk about inequalities in terms of youth mobilization and in youth participation. For example, since we are a patriarchal community, in which we have a lot of male domination. So basically, the power is in the hands of the males. And we as women are limited. We are not given our chances, even the opportunities, to be part, to make a change, or even to have our voices heard. We are usually shut down by the society that we have. We are not encouraged to express ourselves, to show what we have, to show the potential and the change that we might be able to contribute with. For example, in Lebanon, we don't even have the basic rights of giving our nationalities to our children if we actually got married to a foreigner. Our children are by themselves even deprived from their right of being citizens. And this by itself, it highlights the inequality that we're kind of facing. Adding to that, the culture that we live in is also, it highlights the inequality. It promotes this mentality of male dominance. For example, me and my brother, when I was a little kid, my parents used to let my brother go out for like 10 p.m. or 12 p.m. But me, no, you have to come home like at 6 or like before the sun goes down. I mean, this by itself, they don't give us the chance to go and to explore the world, to know what's really happening, and to be able to understand our communities and just be engaged and to be able to make this positive change or this change in our community. And that's a small example of the inequalities that we're facing in terms of mobilization and in terms of gender equality. And I can go on and on, especially with the violence against women. I was just reading the news in a bit, and in Tripoli, which is in north of Lebanon, there's 3 people that raped a girl. And they were welcomed. When they came home, they were welcomed with dancing and with a lot of drums because they were freed from prison. And they weren't even held accountable because of that. So basically, they hold the woman responsible when she's attacked by a perpetrator. And this by itself is just unacceptable. And if I also want to move on to youth participation in the decision making, we as youth are impactless, we're marginalized. We have not given the chance to actually have our voice heard and to be able to participate in the decision-making process. If we want to vote in Lebanon, we have to be 21. And if I want to run for elections, I have to be 25. So actually this leaves youth between 18 and 24 not represented. And even youth in between 15 and 18 not even knowing or not even being able to join any political party, not being able to raise this awareness or this mindset concerning what is happening in their societies. So how they do expect us to be able to, when we're 25, to be able to take decisions, to be able to have a good future if we are not even part of the planning of this future? If they are taking the decisions for us and we are not even consulted of what we want to have. So basically we are just bearing the consequences of their decisions that they are taking every day. Now, how we can tackle such inequalities that we have? Since the public sector and the government in Lebanon are quite dysfunctional in terms of youth participation, and since the private sector, whether it was economically or even socially, they're not integrated or engaged in the communities that we have. So this burden lies down on the civil society organizations and the NGOs that we have, whether it was internationally, regionally, or locally. So we are, as youth, we are being supported by those NGOs, by projects and initiatives that they have been implementing in order to promote such culture, in order to support us as youth, to take part in the decision-making process, and even to raise awareness against the gender inequality, youth mobilization, and even the gap that is existing in between the rural areas and the urban areas that we have. For example, we have been working for a long time on youth participation in municipalities. And this year, in the 2016 elections, even though we didn't have much participation of women, even though it increased, I mean, it's 5.4% at the moment of women participation. It was even less before. In between 128 ministers, we only had 1 or 2 ministers that were women, and they were both wife or like a daughter of a political leader. So that doesn't even count if you want to talk logically about it. So, but the good part is that this year, the 2016 elections, we actually had independent parties formed by youth and coming from different backgrounds, and even they had gender equality in some lists of people running for election. And they actually, when they ran against the political parties, they had to join forces. Like the ones that were always against each other and they were always fighting, they actually joined forces to be able just to stand against those independent people. In Beirut, for example, the independent people got 40% of the votes, which is like really, they really came close to actually taking over the decision making and being able to have this fresh blood in the political life that we have. And this by itself, it shows the awareness that we've been raising. And it encourages all the NGOs and all the people that are working in this domain to keep doing that, because we are seeing change. Maybe it's small steps, but that's what builds up. Like it's a bit by bit, and then you just get a big stack of change that you have in your community. So this was just a small overview and testimony that I wanted to share with you. And I would also like to add something small about it, which is youth municipal councils. Because I do believe if we want to progress and if we want to move forward, we need to have fresh ideas. And that's what youth have. We have the creativity. We have the new initiatives that we would like to implement in the communities. Because at the end, it is our future. So why not us be engaged right now in the present to be able to plan it properly? And if you have any questions, I'm free to answer. And thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you very much, Ivan. We'll be coming back to you in the discussion. That was quite an inspiring story from Lebanon about both the problems, but also how youth are working to challenge and change that situation in a situation that is extremely constrained, particularly for young women. Very inspiring to take us into the next section. So we've talked quite a bit so far about the nature of the problem, all its different roots and causes, and the kind of systemic transformation that we're looking for. And we've talked in many ways about a lot of the solutions that we know: land redistribution, living wages, collective bargaining, an economy that is fairer for women, isn't patriarchal. Whole number of other things that would enable the kind of just and equitable and sustainable society that we're all fighting for, and that moves on from this market fundamentalism that is causing so much of the current phenomenon that we're seeing. We've talked about some of that, but let's go into more depth about the kind of strategies for change that we should be pursuing, how that looks locally and nationally, and then some thoughts about the kind of movement we're looking to build globally that would support and amplify that. So, Joki, over to you to kick us off.
Thank you. A lot has been said, and I feel like we are getting towards the end, and a lot of information overload. So I'm just going to, I had written up a lot to say, but I want to just make a few remarks, pass it on to Lydia, and maybe the rest of it will come out in our discussion and exchange. In terms of strategy and how we go about creating change, I learned about activism and campaigning from my mother, and recently somebody was talking to her about the success that they had in the Green Belt movement in Kenya, and asked her, how did you know you were going to succeed? And she said something that I thought was quite profound and very simple but very profound. She said, because we were fighting for the land that our fathers died for. This great conviction that, you know, we are following in the footsteps of others who have gone before us, who have fought very valiantly, who have given it all, including their lives, and understanding that the situation or the status quo today is not what they gave their lives for. They wanted better. They wanted to live a world and to have a world that is better than the world that we have. And so the struggle, as you say, continues. And she also, my mother, her name is Lillian Jeo. She's not just my mother. She has her own identity. There was a film made about Wangari Maathai, the late Wangari Maathai, and in there she has a quote that's where she says that the message to the world is that the little grassroots people can change the world. And I think that in the way that we're thinking about the fight and building inequality, we have to be very conscious and intentional about how we engage with ordinary people who are the ones who know this better than we actually do. It is imperative. We have to engage with them. We have to let them be able to tell their stories. We have to let them have their voice. On the first day here, we had a presentation of the Kilimanjaro Women's Initiative, which is about women's land rights in Africa. And one of the things that we've been emphasizing is the need for women to actually be able to tell their stories, both positive and negative ones, so that people understand why this is so important. I think, Shamli, your presentation and talking about land, I thought should have been there at that event to kind of give this big framework, because people see land as just this possession, but they don't necessarily see the bigger picture of what it means to actually have that land available to you in terms of quality of life, in terms of opportunities, in terms of security, from food security to sort of belonging. It's the security of knowing that you belong to a place because you are part, the land is part of who you are. So the 2 points that I want to make before I pass on to Lydia, then we can have a bigger discussion, is that I think the realization that is more and more coming to be, and people taking action, is about the inequality that exists around the world, and there is no longer this idea that it is only in the global south. The inequality in the north, in Canada, in the US, in Europe, is becoming more and more visible, and we are becoming more and more willing to engage and to deal with that. For a long time, it was that those problems of inequality, those problems of sexism, those problems of gender violence, or whatever problems you wanted to identify, they were somewhere far off in another country, or if you dare to discuss them within your country, then they were in some other community that was not my community. It is those other people. I have told the story of when I was a college student in the US, and part of the Women's Resource Center on campus, I got invited to speak to a group of women in Geneva, New York. Geneva is about that big. And I can tell you, people of any brown shade were not very common. And so the people who had invited me, I didn't know who they were. So I was invited and asked to meet these at someone's house before we go to the session. And I literally, I kid you not, I go in, and it is this house that unbelievable. And there are 3 women, and we are there to have sherry before we go to the presentation, if that tells you anything. And so we start having a conversation, and it was about domestic violence. And at that time, I remember that the quote out there somewhere was that 1 out of every 3 women in the US would encounter domestic violence. And I don't know why I put out this little factoid, which was in politics for me to do. And I said, what it means is that, and I go 1, 2, 3, the 3 of you, 1 of you, or 1, 2, 3, the 3 of us, 1 of us. And we did go to the presentation, but the scholarship that was on the table, I never heard about ever again. And one of the women had actually responded to me that that must happen in northern Geneva, which is where the Latinos and African Americans live. So the point being that people would see it out there and not in here. It's about them and not about us. The other point that I want to make is that as we think about this, it also becomes very important the approach that we take. Is it a charity approach or is it a justice approach? If we are talking about inequality, I'm doing this because I want to help poor Shanley. She's so oppressed and she can't speak for herself. And if that is the approach, it won't really get very far. And we will not succeed. So we actually need to be very intentional about what approach we take. The idea of speaking for the voiceless, voice for the voiceless, yeah, it doesn't fly. In fact, time and time again, the people who are saying we are a voice for the voiceless are actually the people who are rendering the so-called voiceless by speaking for them. So needing to have people present, engaged, and listening to them and having them have the opportunity to make, to tell their stories. I want to end seriously with I'm ending now with 2 quotes. One of them is an African proverb that says, if you want to walk fast, go alone. If you want to walk far, go with others. And this is really something that we need to embrace as we talk about fighting inequality. Going fast or going far. Going alone or going with others. The last quote is one from an Aboriginal woman from Australia, Lila Watson. People probably know it, but it's the one that says, if you have come to help me, I don't need your help. But if you have come because your liberation is tied to my liberation, come, let us work together. And I think that is the challenge that we have of working together, of fighting for collective liberation and fighting inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jyoti. So then before we open up for more discussion and reflections, fantastic to hear from Liddy. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning again. I'm sorry for being late. Well, I think it's a far easier job for me now because the first speakers have actually all laid out the analysis, the context, and the basis for inequality and inequity, because I think we need to address both. My job this morning is to talk about strategies, but I'm not going to talk about that in terms of proposing new ideas. What we have to do actually is to look at what are the current struggles and campaigns that people are actually doing now. And it's not just the global ones, but most especially, which are really the firm foundations of any strategy, campaign, or struggles, what is actually going on inside our countries at the local level and at the national level. When we look at strategies and campaigns and struggles, there are many, and as many as the list of issues and manifestations of inequality and inequity that Shalmali has shared. There are those struggles. There are struggles for land, for water, there's struggles of women, struggles for essential services, struggles for better wages and living and working conditions, and so on. I'd like to give some food for thought as we intensify our participation in these struggles and look at how these struggles address inequality and inequity. One is that it's important to see that they roughly come under two categories. One category would be struggles and campaigns that have the aim of reducing this inequity and inequality, of alleviating the living conditions of people, of providing some economic relief. And as I say it and describe it, I'm not diminishing the value and importance of these kinds of struggles. Because as we have to be reminded, ours is not just a struggle for some dream of a better world out there. Ours is a struggle for the here and now, for our people to be able to experience a better quality of life. And also to understand that for us to win that struggle in the far future, we need to have some victories now. That's how people get convinced to pursue it, because they realize that there is worth and value to struggling collectively, to walking together and not just walking past by yourself. And there are many examples that I would like to mention now, because these are ongoing campaigns. So for instance, what I would like to see as the twin campaign for fighting for essential services, for public services, as well as fighting for tax justice and for fiscal justice, I might add, because it's not just about tax, it's also about the debt issues and so on. Why are we fighting for tax justice? This is not just about making sure, for instance, that the corporations pay their fair share of taxes. We have to struggle for that because we want and we need the resources to be used for our people. It's not just about, and this is why we have to be careful when we explain this to our movements on the ground. This is not about asking, fighting so that our government will have more money, period. Because they won't get convinced to be involved in that. They already know that our governments waste money, for instance. But because we are fighting to demand from our governments these services. And it's a real question about where to get these resources. So there's a lot about tax that I'm sure the other organizations here can tell you about, why we are demanding that tax system should be fair, should be progressive, and should address the question of inequality in an equitable way. And this is where I would like to introduce the difference between the two terms, in my view, and why we have to be, it's very important for us to fight for both. We're saying we want to be equal, but that means we need systems have an equitable treatment of people. You have to tax the rich more than the poor. equality is not, well, we all have to be taxed in the same way. That's being equal. No, we have to understand that there are different conditions that people live in, and therefore policies and treatment of communities and people cannot be the same. You know? They have to be equitable. There are also campaigns, for instance, where we are fighting for better wages and working conditions. And here, it's very interesting to know that it's no longer and should not be just about having higher wages. It also should be about working conditions, including the length of time for work. So it's very inspiring, for instance, that there are now successful struggles to shorten the work time from what traditionally is the 8 hours, because that was what was won many, many, many decades ago against seemingly no working hours, to have, I think, was it Sweden or Denmark who passed now legislation up for a 6-hour workday. So that's also important because it also introduces a lot of notions about work, being dignified, being decent, and the notion about the right not to have work in the remaining time of your day. You know? So these are really very important struggles. Or for instance, and I would like to bring it to another scale, when we struggle in the climate campaign for climate finance, because it is said in the convention that one of the responsibilities of the rich countries who created the problem of climate change to provide finance so that people in the South, in developing countries who did not contribute to this problem, be enabled to deal with the impacts of climate change, be enabled to quickly shift to more sustainable systems because we need global solutions. Reducing inequality, you know? We have to think about that because there's an unequal and inequitable relationship and comparison between responsibilities of nations and people, and therefore part of addressing that inequality and inequitable situation is making sure that there is redistribution of wealth, of financial resources to other countries, to other people, so that the situation is more equitable, so that we have a more equitable chance, no, of dealing with the impacts of climate change. So all these struggles are very important, but we also have to realize that they're simply reducing the inequality and the inequity. They are not necessarily already addressing the root causes of inequality and inequitability. So we have other campaigns that address the root causes. And when I say the root causes, of course, we have to recognize that a lot of the inequity in society also has, as part of the root causes, the economic inequity. There's economic inequity and inequality. There is race, there is gender, for instance, and others. But race and gender, part of the basis for that inequality is also economic inequality. So for me, one of the important, not the only, but one of the important aspects is addressing economic inequality. And we have to go beyond description. We have to go beyond description and look at the structural causes, which Shalmali has already pointed out. And it is rooted in the highly inequitable control and, in many cases, ownership of resources, of economic resources, and the highly inequitable control of political power. These two are very much related. Those who have economic power have the political power. And we need to address the question of political power because it has also had a life of its own, the highly inequitable political structures now. So there are campaigns that strike at the heart of this. There are struggles that strike at the heart of this. And one of the things I will mention, which is a favorite of Shalmali, Joke, and myself, is the land struggle. This is addressing a part of the heart of the question. What we are fighting for in the land struggles, and we have been fighting for this for centuries, because a problem of the inequitable control of land is one of the worst products of colonialism. Because in many of our countries, before the colonizers came, we didn't have a situation of only a few families in the population controlling most of the land. This came about because of our colonial experience, because of how colonizers set up the economic structures and control of resources in our countries. And that is why they came, because of our land. And land, as Jyoti says, is not just land, it's also freshwater bodies, it's also the minerals inside the land. It's many things. That's why the new term, the territoriality, it's because it's not just even the land and the water and the minerals inside it, the air and the atmosphere right above it. It's a whole territory that they control. And today it is still true in most of our countries that the majority of land is owned by elites and corporations. So unless you address that, unless you redistribute land, unless you ensure that communities not just have access to the resources, but actually are in stewardship of the land. I'm now trying to avoid the term ownership, not because I don't think it's a relevant issue, but our alternative shouldn't really be ownership, but should be stewardship. Ownership implies we can do anything with it because we own it. No? Stewardship, I think, is a much more closer notion to what we had before colonization. The land is for everybody. And we cannot own it because it is also for future generations. So we have to keep it in a condition where also future generations can be supported by the land and the resources. So this is one example of a struggle that strikes at the heart of the roots of inequality and inequity. And in looking at these two types of struggles, we have to always remember that one should support the other, especially the struggles to just mitigate, reduce somewhat for economic relief and so on. When we do that, we have to be very careful not to give off the impression that this is it. That if you increase the workers' wages by 20%, that's it. They should be happy. That's what they should be getting. And if they're already getting it, they should just shut up and be happy that they were granted. One of the cultural aspects to elites is the sense of entitlement. And one of the consequences of that is when we demand something and then we are given what we demand, there is this attitude that, well, we already gave them what they're asking for, and what else are you complaining about? So we have to be very careful, because part of the cultural domination is this sense of entitlement by the elites, and our sense of, because it happens culturally, that if we are given, there is a sense of gratitude that we are given our rights. I mean, that should really be part of the things that we should address. But those are the two types of struggles that are going on today. And it's a big challenge for us, especially when the world gets more complicated. There's a lot of economic and financial crisis, to keep in mind that a little better life is not all that we are asking for. We are trying to transform the world. And we need to have this much better life in the near future, but not to forget that we should be contributing also to a much more transformative or systemic transformation that is a longer fight that we need to make, but definitely not a fight we should be postponing. We should also be thinking of how our current campaigns and what kind of new campaigns we should be and struggles we should be developing so that we actually address the heart of inequality and inequity. I also would like to just add, for the emphasis, that our other struggles, like, well, in the Philippines, we are probably not as sensitive to racial and anti-discrimination struggles, but there are issues, especially with our indigenous people, especially with, for instance, minorities in the population in terms of religion. For instance, it's a majority Christian country, so there's a much smaller population. But there are issues like that, and we need to also be sensitive that in all of our struggles, the race and the gender and the environment dimensions are not separate, totally separate dimensions, but they should be, what do we call that, Charlotte? They should be running thread, there should be cross-cutting issues and dimensions interrelated in our different struggles. So it's a challenge to keep that in mind, to keep checking ourselves. Are we actually properly integrating these dimensions in these different campaigns and struggles that we have? And on the other hand, there's also the challenge, for instance, of women's groups, to which we also belong, that we don't take the question of gender equality out of the context of the economic and political situations that we face now. Probably that's also something I would like to share as and I'm very supportive of this idea because we came from the youth movement ourselves. That's why we're still here and inspired to spend our lives, but also to understand youth come from different races, classes, and genders. So we have to be sensitive in building a youth movement of this very important condition or situation. I'd like to end there so we have more time for discussion. Thank you.
Great contributions from Joki and Liddy for us to think about how to build on the struggles that are already undergoing and how we might amplify and grow those. And we've got a good range of people from different, I'm sure everyone's involved in different movements, lots of different countries in the room. So I'd like to invite people to share any additional stories that they have of their experiences that they want to add to the conversation, any contributions you'd like to make, or any questions for the panel. So the floor is open for some discussion. You're either welcome to just go from there or come and use the mic if you feel more comfortable.
I'll try from here, and if it doesn't work, yeah, okay. So you have to introduce myself.
Yeah.
No. Okay. All right. So I'm Jean Sadana. I come from SITSE. SITSE is a Catholic social justice and development family of organizations. Really, thank you very much. And first of all, I wanted to say congratulations for a very powerful all-woman panel. So well done, organizers. I'm sorry I came in late, so maybe Shamli already discussed this because this is a conversation we've already been having. I really appreciate the frame you set us in, Liddy, about kind of the immediate struggles for immediate kind of needs of many of the movements and the communities that we are living in, and the kind of the systemic struggles. Interesting that you put it kind of framed it in colonialism. I'd like to add another dimension, which we've been discussing, which is extractivism. Colonialism and extractivism in relation to gender, to race are all very much interconnected. I mean, extractivism and gender, extractivism and labor, extractivism and colonialism. They are essentially the root causes. And my question about going forward in our strategy is, how are we going to bring this all together? How is an inequity campaign going to address extractivism as kind of the basic systemic lock-in we are in? And climate change is a part of that frame. So that's just a question.
Great, thanks.
Good morning. My name is Amadi. I've been trying to translate here in Portuñol, so I hope my colleague understood some of the debate. I'm from ActionAid from Mozambique. It's really amazing to listen to the interventions and all the thinking behind the challenge that we are all facing in terms of inequality. But I have a sort of a conceptual problem with me now. And I'm sort of divided. And it's not necessarily a question. It's for the panelists, but it's a question for me as well. Because for us, being here and recognizing how complex are the causes of inequality, but at the same time, listening to the alternatives that we are putting in place, it's like we are within this system that is created in neoliberalism, the capitalism. We're inside this system. We live in this system. And the solutions that we are proposing are within this system. So I question myself, are those solutions really going to address the problem? Probably not. It might fix here and there, but at the end of the day, it may not resolve the problem. I'm looking at this beautiful place where we are. Who decided that the World Social Forum should be here? Why should we be meeting in this place? Why not meeting in the Canadian indigenous community where the problems are? Why are we using these microphones, technologies, and everything? And we are challenging this. So that is a fundamental question that I have. So one option is to be inside the system and propose few changes here and there. It's okay, it's fine. We win today and we win tomorrow, then we are happy, and that's it. But deep down, all of us, we recognize that this won't change. That might be one. The other option is to be radical and to say, this is a failure. This model will not resolve the problem. So we need a new model. We need an alternative. And all of us that are here, with all the movements and the groups and the youth and the indigenous, all that we have outlined, come together and draft the alternative of the world that we want. But the question as well to myself is that possible? So those are questions that now, I'm having, and I don't have answers to it. That I need to stand up to say this thing, so that I share my problem with you as well. So it becomes your problem as well.
Thanks, Imade. Yep, your question, your problem is certainly all of our problems, so don't worry about that. Good, so yeah, big questions coming out on the nature of extractivism. How do we include that in our analysis and our solutions? The complexity of the causes. Are we content with, well, it's a build, I suppose, on Liddy's input about needing to have immediate wins for fear of people just giving up and feeling hopeless. We have to build the struggle from somewhere, but how do we at the same time, and Joki mentioned this too, how do we at the same time make sure that we are really building towards systemic transformation and it's not a trade-off between the two things? Further, before I come back to the panel for magic answers on these incredibly difficult questions, further inputs. Anyone have any stories to share, insights? 1, 2, any more? 3. Let's have those 3, and then we'll come back to the panel for a wrap-up, and then we have something to go to. We have a practical task at the end. Okay. Please. Or 4, sorry. Yeah. Please.
So hello, everybody. This is just, I guess, my experience of being in Montreal over the last year. I'm from England originally. I'm white, I'm male, there's not much inequality against me. But I lived for 1 year in a place called Corps Généreux. It was a commune with 15 other people. We did things very radically. We ate out of dumpsters. We hosted events like the Organization for Louis Lebeau, the protests and things like that. And we tried an alternative way of living. And then 3 or 4 months ago, our building got bought by a new owner. And then a couple of weeks ago, we got illegally evicted on a Sunday. AKA, we were inside our building, and then private security came inside, told us we had to get out. And then we weren't allowed back in. One person was allowed to go in to retrieve our items for us. and we were told to find a new place to stay that evening. You know, and some people have been living there for 5 years. And the police came twice, and the police advised to me, you should ask the owner for a couple of $100 and just go about your business. You know, because we didn't have a written lease that was up to date. I now know there is such a thing as an oral lease. And yeah, just, you know, inequality can come knocking on your door in many shapes and forms. And because the owner, this man, had a piece of paper with a few numbers on it that had a few more numbers than we did, that he was able to kick 15 people out onto the street and tell them to go find another place. And we are subsequently suing. So we're going to continue that fight that way. So that's it.
I'll take all four and then do the wrap.
So I think, Marit, was maybe following up on your comment. So I'm from Denmark. We have a historical strong union. It's like world famous strong unions. And now what they're mostly doing is protecting Danish workers' rights. So it's becoming no international solidarity and no perspective on solving longer term crisis, but solutions right here, right now. We have NGOs working to protect their brand, working within 1 year frame, lock frames, reporting back. So I'm inspired of a broad alliance, but also maybe your reflections on how to make it work, how to go beyond unions protecting their own interests, NGOs protecting brands, and how to get perspectives of not NGOs and not unions inside your broad movement for equality. Thanks.
Yeah, just a comment, or a couple of comments. One comment is that on the question of colonialism, sorry, I'm Samir, I live in Johannesburg, South Africa. On the question of colonialism and its relationship to our inequality, there's been a lot of space. I think we need a separate discussion, maybe that we can't have here, about governments that claim to be anti-colonial, but are in fact perpetuating colonial policies. And I think a lot of our governments
are doing that. Yeah.
So especially in South Africa, where the government's rhetoric is so progressive and its actions are so regressive, it just sort of slaps in the face, the difference between rhetoric and reality. But I know many of us have similar experiences. My second point was just that, you know, when I joined this work and I was looking to some of the people on the panel as my mentors and teachers, you know, it was kind of, the enemies were kind of clear. The enemy was kind of global capitalism, the enemy was the IMF, the enemy was corporate power, and to some extent they still are. But we're now living in a world post-2008 where those enemies, especially sort of neoliberalism, has no justification, moral justification or any other kind of justification for pursuing their policies, yet they still pursue them. So the naked self-interest is very, very obvious. And I guess it's a challenge to all of us that, okay, if this has been obvious now for almost a decade, why haven't we been able to make more gains? Or have we made gains? I mean, have we made a lot of gains in the last decade? So it's an open question. But for me, from where I sit, it feels like we haven't made the kind of gains that an economic crisis that basically showed that global capitalism is a big house of cards. We haven't been able to advance our movements and our struggles and reduce inequalities and fight for equity in the way that I think we should. So maybe I'm being pessimistic, but I'd like to hear others take too.
And then finally.
Good afternoon. Buenos días.
Omar, good morning.
Yo vengo de Guatemala, de un pueblo maya Chortí.
I come from Guatemala, from an indigenous community called Chortí.
Y voy a hablar poco porque tengo problemas con el idioma de ustedes.
I'm going to speak just little because I have a challenge with the language.
Aunque comprendo mucho cuando hablan en inglés, mi cerebro se rehúsa a hablarlo.
I understand a bit when you speak in English, but my mind refuses in English.
No sé por qué.
I don't know why.
Yeah. Nosotros con el pueblo Maya Chortí iniciamos hace 20 años un trabajo de recuperación de nuestro territorio.
we as the Chorti community, we started 20 years ago a program of reclaiming our lands.
Porque comprendimos que ahí es donde el sistema capitalista, el racismo, va a darnos la batalla.
Because we understand that there it's where we will defeat the capitalist system, the racism, all the challenges.
Porque para existir el capitalismo necesita nuestra tierra, nuestra agua, nuestros bosques y nuestras manos.
Because for capitalism to exist, it needs our land, it needs our water, it needs our forest, it needs our hands.
Entonces, trabajamos también tratando de cambiar las leyes en el país.
But we also work to change the laws in the country.
Y retando las leyes del país.
And re-editing or changing the policies.
Pero también retándonos a nosotros nuestras formas de hacer adentro.
But also we challenge ourselves the way we do our work.
Hemos ido construyendo nuestra propia forma económica en el territorio.
So we have been developing even our own way of economically organizing ourselves.
El tema económico, el tema alimentario, salud, cultura.
So we have been critically thinking of how we organize our economy, how we organize our health system, how our culture, those elements we challenge ourselves.
Porque cuando el poder siente que no le pides nada, tiene miedo.
Because the power, when they feel, when you don't demand them anything, then they get afraid. Why don't you demand them something?
Pero cuando tú le pides al poder, él siente que puede negociar contigo.
But when you demand from those who have power, then they feel that yes, you need them. Then they can negotiate with you.
Y comprendimos que el trabajo en nuestros territorios debe ser integral, visto desde todos los ángulos, espiritual, material, social.
Therefore, the alternatives in our community, it has to be seen, it has been thought in all the dimensions, spiritual, economical, social. It has to be integral.
Eso a veces nos lleva a problemas cuando quiere llegar una contraparte a trabajar con nosotros.
And that poses a challenge when a third party comes and wants to work with us.
Porque la nación amiga, solidaria, debe cambiar su forma de ver.
Because even those who are coming on the name of solidarity, when they come to work with us, they need to change their assumptions for them to work with us.
Quiere llevar su forma de pensar, su agenda hacia nosotros para decirte quiero ayudar.
They come with their own agenda, with their prescription, and they say, we want to help you, but those are the terms for us to be in solidarity with you.
Y eso, a veces, en vez de ayudar, debilita tus propias luchas.
And that kind of solidarity, instead of strengthening our struggle, it weakens our struggle.
Porque en vez de pensar en tu propia estrategia, estás pensando en lo que el otro quiere.
Because instead of you thinking on your own strategy, now you need to please the one who's coming to help you.
Y entonces nosotros a veces decimos, no queremos que nos ayudes.
Due to that, some of us, we say, no, thank you. We don't want you to help us.
Si quieres caminar con nosotros, puedes venir. Si quieres que jalarnos en tu camino, no te queremos.
If you want to come and help us and walk with us, then it's okay. But if you want to help us in your own terms, then no, thank you.
Porque creemos que la nueva forma de hacer es vernos como iguales.
Because we believe the new way of solidarity is for the solidarity to look at us the way we are.
Donde podemos intercambiar ideas, discutirlas, caminar con ellas.
And see the space where we can discuss ideas and together we can agree and we can walk together.
Porque si no, solo reproducimos el sistema que criticamos también.
Otherwise, we are replicating the system that we are always criticizing.
Y como decía una de las jóvenes que habló, tenemos que empezar por nosotros.
And as one of the youth that spoke there was saying, we need to start from us.
Y nosotros somos un colectivo.
And when I say us, it's a collective of us, not me.
Y creemos que ahí es donde las batallas las vamos a ganar.
And I believe there is where we will win the struggle.
Cuando hacemos juntos y retamos juntos el poder.
Because when we do together, then we are challenging the power of those with power.
Tú no retas el poder produciendo alimentos sanos para llevar al mercado.
You don't challenge those with power simply by producing fair and green and healthy food and taking that food to the market of where those with power will buy.
O haciendo grupos de productores o productoras que producen para una cadena de valor.
Or supporting a small group of producers so that they can produce to a particular, chain of the market.
Solo le facilita al sistema entrar a tus conocimientos y llevarlos y corporatizarlos.
That only will help the system to come and penetrate into your community, learn, and use that knowledge and transform, commodify that knowledge.
Nuestro principio en la comunidad es que primero comemos nosotros.
Our principle is that what we produce is to feed ourselves first.
Luego compartimos con los demás.
And after that, we can share with the others.
Y eso le da miedo al sistema.
And that creates threats to the system.
Porque ya no dependes de él.
Because we don't depend on their market for us to survive.
En mi comunidad decimos que somos tontos.
And in the community, we used to say that we are idiots.
Cuando dejamos que el sistema controle la energía y la comida.
When we allow the system to control the energy and the food.
El que te da de comer dicen que tienes que hacer.
Because those who give you food, they will tell you what to do.
Por eso es que esa es una batalla que tenemos que ganar.
Because therefore that is one of the struggles that we must win.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Omar, and everyone else. I realize we've come to a very rich point in the discussion. It feels very, it feels like an incredibly powerful discussion. But I realize we're also over time. So I just wanted to, there were a number of excellent reflections there on approaches, alternatives that people have tried, but also some quite big questions on how we make sure we push for transformative solutions and not just the immediate victories. How do we know in the longer term, why are we not making bigger gains? If we look back historically over all the crises and all the struggles that have happened over the last decades, why are we not further forward? A bit of soul searching, but also and then what the right kind of solidarity is for different struggles. Before we close up, I wondered if there were any final reflections from the panel on any of those things. You can keep it quite short.
I'd just like to a couple of points on strategies and struggles. One is, I think, yes, on the issue of extractivism, yes, I did address it, but we can talk about that later. On the issue, Samir is leaving, so I will request you to stay a few seconds. I think one of the biggest problems that we've had in the last 25 years is NGOization, development and NGOization. Yeah. I think the development edifice has built a world of NGOs, so-called CSOs or whatever it's called, as though civil society does not exist in villages, in unions, in workers, in communities, And these formations have been domesticating, demobilizing forces. These strong struggles have been demobilized, let me just put it that way, because of this NGO type development, blah, blah, blah. And I think the development industry has played a very powerful role in entrenching inequality and in disabling really strong popular resistance and mobilizing against it. And I think all those of us who are connected with the NGO world would do well to reflect on whether we are part of the solution. Are we really marching? Are we really marching forward, together, as all the panelists have said? Or are we diverting the struggle? Are we diverting the energies? And I think that's a big issue, And another thing is, I think there are very, very strong struggles happening which are not putting us in the capitalist system. Land occupations, water occupations, people coming up and saying, no, I'm not going to take this anymore, what I call the Rosa Parks moment. When she said, bullshit, we've been oppressed for too long, I'm sitting in the front of the bus.
Yeah.
And I think we need those revolutionary moments. We need many more of those revolutionary moments, because people are fighting back so hard. Because I think, as all of you have said, the issues of inequality and inequity are very deep, are manifestations of the worst violations of justice and dignity. Don't keep quiet about it. So I see actually a lot of hope in fighting, but I think we need to what's the word for it? I think we need to look within our own communities of change actors and see how much, to what extent we're helping or not helping these struggles.
I'd just like to add, because I was struck by our colleague from Mozambique by the questions. First of all, I think it's part of the NGOization that people from NGOs do not see that there are very vital movements going on subverting the system. So to be fair and to be honest, we can't say, why are we just working within the system? Maybe why are you working within the system? Because there are many movements that are not and are working to subvert the system. Secondly, we also have to realize that we have to be quite cunning and sophisticated and sharp about what are the instruments and strategies we use, including subverting it from within. Including using what the instruments, the system supposedly provides people, but they're actually not. And turning them into instruments that you can actually use for campaigning and for winning for your people. That's why it's part of our options of strategies and tactics that we use courts, we use intergovernmental processes, we use parliaments, but we have to have that vision clear in mind so that we don't go off wondering about and doing all sorts of things that will tend to give people the idea that there's something going on, but there's actually not much progress being made. So we have to be, so we can't, and in that sense, I will also say that is why NGOs are also important for our struggle. NGOization and being against that doesn't mean we don't need NGOs. We need to have all forms of organizations that will be helpful for our struggle, that we can employ so many different tactics and approaches, because we need that, because they're doing it against us, employing all sorts of things against us, and we have to be even more clever than they about fighting our fights. So yeah, we don't want NGOization, but we also need NGOs in that sense. But NGOs have to keep in mind that the movements are paramount here, that we are serving movements, and that we need to build movements. And in the end, what is important in our struggles and campaigns, are we actually building power of people? Because in the end, the whole struggle is about changing the balance of power, changing the relations of power. It's not just simply winning particular policies. Are we accumulating power so that one day we are able to subvert the entire system and build something new? We don't build a new system simply by sitting down and drafting alternatives. We have to have power behind those alternatives. And that's why we need to be out there in the field building that power, not just showing what can be as alternatives, but actually accumulating that power so we can implement it in a grand scale, not just in little pockets of resistance.
Any more final questions?
Just a final word. Just on extractivism, I say that I think that is an issue that we could do a lot of work to connect in the mind of Canadians, especially Canadian youth, with inequality. Because Canada, as we know, our corporations are heavily involved in extractivism. Here in Canada, with First Nations communities and abroad, there could be a lot of benefit from connecting that struggle to inequality and turning youth onto it here and abroad. And then I just wanted to reiterate, I think it's so important that we do recognize the potential of NGOs to reinforce and create inequalities, especially when it comes to youth. We're recommending in this paper that governments become more aware of what their young people are already doing, but the same could be said for NGOs. It's not a question of getting youth to be more active. They are already there, they're already active. It's a question of putting our resources to go to them and to learn from them, and to take the time that demands and not to impose a timeline or an agenda. And to recognize that sometimes the most helpful thing is to take the back seat or to be less involved. Yeah, and just the last thing on the contribution from our Guatemalan colleague, your quote reminds me a lot of a quote from Thomas Sankara, the leader of Burkina Faso in the 80s, a socialist leader who said, if you want to see where neocolonialism is, look at your plate. It's in your food.
Just a quick note, which I think we've said this, all of us variously and indirectly, but it bears stating, and it is making the links between the various struggles. Because sometimes I think as we go and work in communities, the idea of campaigns and projects actually also demobilizes the struggles that people are engaged in. So making the connection that between sexism and racism and the need for environmental protection, making those connections and understanding that the women who are fighting for their right to land are also the ones who are fighting against domestic violence, and they are fighting against any number of other things. And if it gets too compartmentalized, that word, it adds to their burden rather than helps in them achieve the justice that they're fighting for.
I promise I won't take much of your time, and before I get too audacious in trying to solve all the woes of social movements by oversimplifying things in terms of where do we go from here. I'll say one thing, and I'll steer quickly back into my lane of the trade unionist world. When we look at the historical context that was laid out, we know that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, our current state of play didn't arise from very polite, asking, may we have this land? Maybe it was on one side of the coin, and on the other there was a direct and deliberate taking of something that was once communal, perhaps in some areas of the world, and what was appropriate, was open. So it wasn't done in a polite way. And I think that sometimes we're thinking perhaps we're not making progress because we don't have it all back. And perhaps we're doing things in a way that is very polite and respectful. I guess my point in saying this in a very roundabout way is that sometimes we just have to take back what's ours in a very deliberate and maybe not so polite way. And that is an alternative of perhaps our patience in writing it out and slowly reversing what has taken hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to come to our state of play is today. I'll steer back into my lane into addressing the issue of how do we in the world of labor work outside of our silos and develop more global solidarity. My comrade as director of International of the Canadian Labour Congress is in the room, so I hope I do this some justice. Social unionism isn't a new phenomenon. We are now breaking away from the bread and butter issues of labor and branching out into the community and developing coalitions here in Canada. And the more we do that, we break out of the sort of wage and working conditions, which are very important, but may not appeal to people as broadly as we would like. So I think we need to focus on coalition building and allyship. And when I mention allyship, I want to say that we need to not treat that as, this isn't a fad. Solidarity was once that fad word, and now it's sort of transitioned in the local context to allyship. To be an ally, to be in solidarity with someone, it consists of a great deal of trust, first and foremost. When we're looking at populations that have been oppressed over and over and are still oppressed, over and over again, each day to the point of unfathomable conditions, we can't assume that we come into situations like this with solutions that are our own. We can't be so audacious to think that our solution is one that would fit another without building trust first. And I think that we need to really play out allyship and solidarity in a way that removes us from our privilege and the audacity to think that we know better. And I say we, because sometimes I'm placed in that place of a spectrum of privilege and in a position where I have more privilege than some at the table. In a lot of cases, I do not, as a young racialized woman, right? Not treat social justice movements as a fad, as perhaps a lifestyle, as a career sort of, ambition, but to really deeply root our struggle and connect our struggle with others, even if we don't completely understand it. So allyship and solidarity and branching out of our silos, really underlying truth of that is trust. I will leave it there. I think. Thank you. Okay. And in the non-NGOization of this alliance, I don't feel the need to summarize and have the final word in what everyone said, because you've heard it better from our panelists and from your interventions. So I won't do a summary, but I've been quite inspired by this session and by the depth of amazing movement building that's already going on, the level of collective analysis, wisdom, skills, passion, trust that we're building. Those things all inspire me. The only thing I will do, as it's approaching nearly 12 o'clock, is to invite you all to help fight an inequality that has risen at this World Social Forum. I'm sure you have already heard there is a march today starting at 12 o'clock about the denial of visas to many participants particularly from the Global South, for this World Social Forum. A large number of people are not able to be here and participate in these sessions, many young people as well. So the march is starting at number 200 Boulevard René Levesque. I think that's the correct address. So we can walk over there together if people don't have the directions. So we can, and apologies for running slightly late. And thank you so much again for making it through the rain for the early session this morning. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.